Just before 10 a.m. on May 22, 1863, 150 men of Sherman's Forlorn Hope form up in front of Ewing's brigade in preparation for their assault against the stockade Redan. These volunteers are responsible for carrying the ladders and planks to help their comrades in their attack. But with their hands full, they will be unable to protect themselves as they cover the 80 rods of open ground just to reach the rebel earthworks. The volunteers, not expecting to survive, write their final letters to their loved ones. Then, after waiting anxiously for the long minutes to pass, the clock strikes 10 a.m. With a loud cheer, the Forlorn Hope charges forward. Once in range of the rebel defenders, their ranks are swept by a perfect hurricane of lead. With every step they take, more and more men drop by the wayside. Those lucky enough to survive grab the gear and push forward. Grant's second assault against the rebel stronghold of Vicksburg has begun. During the pivotal siege of Vicksburg, sharpshooters on both sides fought nerve-wracking battles for days in hopes of dominating their opponents. In these intense contests, the one who can expertly position themselves, choose a target, and time a well-placed shot will win the battle. If this style of competition intrigues you, and you want to have a chance to win up to a $500 Bass Pro Shop gift card, then you should try our video sponsor, Medal Hunter, a PvP military game. In Medal Hunter, you duel with another sniper in various scenarios. In these three-way PvP duels, the better sniper wins on timing, anticipation, and precision with stationary weapons. There are 9 locations to choose from, such as Pearl Harbor, Warsaw, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and more. Each location is based on real operations from past conflicts. In the game, you get to choose from various shooting modes, such as anti-air flak, artillery arcs, sniper precision, and more. When you join Medal Hunter today using my personal code Warhawk, you will get an exclusive welcome package. That's not all. The best part, Medal Hunter is giving away up to $30,000 in Bass Pro Shop gift cards. When you unlock areas 2, 4, 7, and 9, you will earn extra spins on the Bass Pro Shop wheel at mhchallenge.com, where everybody is guaranteed a reward. The giveaway ends on September 13th. Download Medal Hunter now and tell me in the comments below what you have won. May 18th, 1863. Following the crushing of Pemberton's rearguard at the Battle of Big Black River Bridge, Major General Ulysses S. Grant finally overcome the last major obstacle that stands between him and Vicksburg, the city that has, since the beginning of the war, resisted every single federal attempt to be conquered. Now, the only thing that stands between him and opening up the farther waters is Pemberton's battered and demoralized Army of Mississippi. Once all of his corps are across the Big Black, Grant orders the Army of the Tennessee to march upon Vicksburg immediately. But before making any attempt upon the rebel earthworks, Grant secures his base at Haynes Bluff, overlooking the Yazoo River. This is done to ensure that his men, who have gone without a supply line since May 12th, can now start receiving fresh supplies via the Yazoo. With his position secure, Grant now has to decide how he will go about capturing the rebel fortress. This boils down to 2 options: either lay a traditional siege and force Pemberton to capitulate, or risk his army in an all-out assault to take the works by storm. The first, though the safer option, will result in many problems, such as a lengthy preparation, military stalemate, damaged political standing, and disease outbreak. The biggest problem, however, will come from Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, who's currently gathering an army 62 miles away in Canton to relieve Pemberton. If forced into a siege, Grant knows he would have to contend with the enemy forces in the front and rear. If these 2 armies ever managed to link up, Grant would be outnumbered. Whereas the second, though riskier, could result in a massive casualty list. But in the case his men succeed in taking the works, Grant can see his 7-month-long campaign come to a quick end. Grant, believing that the rebels are demoralized, expects him to offer little resistance when his men attack, stating, "The enemy will not make much effort to hold Vicksburg." This optimistic mood is not limited only to the Army command. Engineer Frederick Prime declares, "Our own troops, buoyant with success, are eager for an assault, and will not work well if the slow process of a siege is undertaken." Determined to capture the town before Johnston arrives, Grant decides to risk his men in attacking. With that, the three corps begin forming in the face of the rebel fortifications. In total, Grant arrives in front of Vicksburg with roughly 40,000 men. The northernmost unit, Major General William T. Sherman's 15th Corps, straddles his command on the Graveyard Road. In the middle, Brigadier General James B. McPherson forms his 17th Corps on the Jackson Road. And finally, Major General John A. McClernand bisects his 13th Corps on the Mississippi Central Railroad. Once their men see the rebel earthworks for the first time, they are awestruck by the magnitude of their task before them. One Ohioan writes concisely, "We came within sight of its extensive fortifications. Numerous flags floating over the works proved that the persisting leaders of the enemy would try a last attempt to rally their men to fight again and to save, if possible, the stronghold of rebeldom on the Mississippi River." As Grant's soldiers are mentally preparing to assault the rebel fortifications, the Confederates across the various valleys and ravines are in an equally nervous state. These men, in the aftermath of their two crushing defeats, have little time to prepare before Grant's victorious ranks arrive. Luckily for the despondent Southerners, not all seems lost. First, when the battered rebel army returned to Vicksburg, they regained their composure. Second, Pemberton has two fresh divisions, Smith's and Forney's, who weren't present in the recent debacles and are more than ready to fight. And third, these weary but determined Confederates stand behind nearly impregnable earthworks that have been worked on extensively since last fall. Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, now surrounded in the confines of Vicksburg, is determined to hold out until Johnston can relieve his beleaguered defenders. The force he has on hand is a remnant of the Army of Mississippi that managed to make it inside Vicksburg before Grant's arrival. This consists of roughly 33,000 men from 4 divisions. Pemberton did have another division, Loring's small division, but they were cut off in the retreat following Champion Hill. Though his army rebounded somewhat once they got inside Vicksburg, Pemberton wisely put his 2 fresh divisions at the most threatened points. Defending the northernmost section of earthworks is Major General Martin L. Smith's division. Smith, who is responsible for the construction of Vicksburg's defenses, is tapped to defend the most vital section of the line. His left is anchored by Fort Hill, a high bluff overlooking the river, while his right is anchored by the stockade Redan, built with poplar logs that protect the approach to the city on the Graveyard Road. To Martin's right across the Glass Bayou is Major General John H. Forney's division. Forney's division defends the middle portion of the Vicksburg defenses. His left is anchored by the Great Redoubt that defends the Jackson Road approach to the city, while his right is anchored on the 2nd Texas Linnet that is built to defend the approach on Baldwin's Ferry Road. Major General Carter L. Stevenson's division, one of the battered divisions from Champion Hill, is positioned to defend the right flank of Vicksburg. Stevenson's line consists of the Railroad Redoubt on the left, the Square Fort and Hall's Ferry Road salient in the middle, and the South Fort, overlooking the Warrenton Road. Pemberton's final division, that of Major General John S. Bowen, is stationed behind the lines as a general reserve. If there's a breakthrough, Pemberton will be depending on his resolute Trans-Mississippians to plug the gap. In total, the Confederate earthworks span roughly 8 miles around the city. Given its length, the Federals hope to find the rebel line stretched thin enough for them to break through. However, unbeknownst to Grant's men, Smith has laid out a defensive line that is nearly impervious to land assaults. When designing his earthworks, Smith expertly fused the rugged terrain that surrounds Vicksburg into his defensive line. After building their earthworks atop the various hills and ridges, the rebels cut down all the trees in the vicinity to ensure a clear field of fire. Any attacker forced to charge their lines will have to cross over various open ravines, avoid tripping on laid telegraph wire, negotiate a steep incline splattered with abatis, and cover an 8-foot wide ditch, all before having to scale the 10 to 20 foot walls that the rebels are safely protected behind. In this open terrain, any soldier brave enough to cross this ground will meet a hell of lead. With their earthworks manned, cannons loaded, and guns cocked, the only thing the Confederates in Vicksburg can do now is wait for the Federals across the valley to make the first move. By the late morning on May 19, 1863, Grant finally moved the entirety of his army to the outskirts of Vicksburg. Once in position, the two armies skirmished in the maze of ravines that formed no man's land. Grant, expecting the rebel defenses to crumble once he applies pressure, orders his subordinates to attack at 2 p.m., with his orders stating, "Push forward carefully and gain as close a position as possible to the enemy's works until 2 p.m. At that hour, they'll fire 3 volleys of artillery from all the pieces in position. This will be the signal for a general charge of all the Army Corps along the whole line." Unfortunately, once 2 p.m. strikes and the signal guns are fired, the Federal Corps commanders bungle their assaults. McClernand, stationed below the railroad, claims he is too far to launch any assault. Thus, instead of attacking the rebel defenses outright, the Illinois general slowly advances his corps into range to trade fire with the defenders. During this exchange, Federal Brigadier General Albert L. Lee receives a nasty head wound and is forced to turn over command. For the rest of the day, McClernand and his officers do nothing more than reconnoiter the rebel defenses. Further north, McPherson is only a little more aggressive than McClernand. Out of the entirety of the 17th Corps, only Ransom's Midwesterners make any sort of attack against the rebel lines. But once they get within rifle range, their ranks are stopped cold by well-placed fire from Hebert's Mississippians. Besides Ransom's half-hearted attack, McPherson spends the rest of the day reconnoitering the rebel lines. While McClernand and McPherson dally in the face of Vicksburg, only Sherman manages to launch any real attack against the Confederates. With only Blair's division in position to attack, all the eyes in the army watch in suspense to see if the Missourian politician will be able to break through. As 2 p.m. nears, Blair forms a division in a crescent around the stockade Redan. While Blair's men form up, the Mississippians within the Redan anxiously watch the growing blue host across the field. Once the clock strikes 2, the cannons ring off with fire, signaling the assault. With cheers, the Federals jump to their feet and rush up the hill towards the Redan. On the right of Blair's division, Ewing's Ohioans make a desperate charge against the 27th Louisiana Lynette. However, the difficult terrain and defenses break up the Federal assaults, reducing their momentum. Nonetheless, with Ewing at the head, the Federals reach the walls and the two sides battle in hand-to-hand combat. Yet, unlike Ewing's men, G.A. Smith's Westerners have to take an awkward approach to the stockade and get bogged down in the ravines as casualties mount. Here, Shoup writes of the Federal attack. "He finally made a rush with the intention of carrying our line, but was met by a terrific fire in front and flank." Finally, on Blair's left, T.K. Smith's Midwesterners have no better luck in their advance, deciding to hug the ground in order not to get hit in the storm of lead. Seeing the Federals concentrate against the stockade Redan, Bowen dispatches Cockrell's Missourians to reinforce that sector. Here, the Missourians strengthen the lines to ensure no breakthrough occurs. Yet, despite their best effort, the Federals are unable to gather enough strength to make a dent in the rebel line. Only a few men are able to make it to the parapets, not enough to overcome the defenders 18 feet above. To make things worse for Blair's men, the rebels discovered that they could throw lit cannonballs onto the huddled blue masses down below. Unable to break through the stout rebel line, and refusing to brave the gauntlet of fire to run back to safety, Blair's men hug the ravines until nightfall to make their escape. Grant, who expected this quick punch to put an end to Confederate resistance, is baffled by the repulse. Nonetheless, the May 19th assaults are an outright defeat for the Federals. They lost 942 men, while the Confederates only lost 70. Writing of the setback, Sherman says, "The rebel parapets were strongly manned, and the enemy fought hard and well." Despite the losses, Grant still believes his men can take the walls. Only one division out of the Army's 8 made any real effort that day. Instead of throwing in the towel and turning straight to siege operations, Grant desires to give it another try, and this time with the whole army participating. Looking back at the failure on May 19th, Grant realizes that more planning is needed. Thus, Grant gives his men a few days rest and will try again when he's ready. Once the supplies start to flow through the Yazoo River, the famished Federals eat their fill and catch up on much needed sleep after nearly a month of marching. Meanwhile, across no man's land, the Confederates anxiously wait for the Federals to give it another go. Brigadier General Stephen D. Lee writes of the tension that fills the rebel earthworks. The nervous tension of all within Confederate limits was kept to the highest pitch. After a few days, Grant is ready to attack again. On the 21st, the general convenes with his corps commanders at his headquarters and issues orders for the next assault. Unlike what happened on the 19th, with Blair's wide line being stopped cold, Grant wants his men to attack in narrow formations, with their fronts not wider than a platoon. The soldiers will have their bayonets fixed and only bring the bare necessities. Because the various earthworks and obstacles broke up their formations before contact, Grant issues tools to each corps to help his soldiers quickly cross no man's land, such as planks across ditches and ladders to scale the parapets. To gather enough material for the necessary gear, Grant allows his own headquarters to be dismantled. Once the orders are issued, Grant sets the assault for the next day at 10 a.m. following a bombardment. Wanting to ensure spirits are high for the attack, Grant rides the lines to see his men that night. As Grant passes by a group of soldiers, a man shouts out, "Hardtack!" Then the rest join in, "Hardtack! Hardtack!" Swayed by his soldiers, Grant orders the cooks to serve a hearty dinner in preparation for the attack, which includes hardtack, beans, and coffee. With spirits high, everybody in the Federal camp expects Vicksburg to finally fall in the morning. On May 22nd, once there's enough light to see, the Federal artillery opens up on the Confederate defenses. Not only are all 220 guns unleashed upon the city, but Porter joins in as well with his mortar ships. Though hoping the bombardment will soften up the rebel defenses, little damage is actually done. During the bombardment, the soldiers begin forming their attack columns. Sherman, the red-haired general, calls on 150 unmarried men to form the Forlorn Hope. This group of men will be the first ones in during the attack, carrying the ladders and planks. Expecting heavy losses in this unit, those who volunteer will receive a 60-day furlough. As the call goes out, soldiers start stepping forward to volunteer. Watching the men step up, Sergeant J.J. Kellogg of the 113th Illinois writes, "We looked upon them as already dead men." Then, once the clock strikes 10 a.m., all three corps begin their attack against Vicksburg. In Sherman's sector, instead of attacking on a wide front like before, Blair's division attacks right down the Graveyard Road. With the Forlorn Hope at the front, Ewing's men make another desperate charge against the rebel parapets. Private John O'Dea in the 8th Missouri recalls their charge. "It felt like hell was escaping through one great vent, and we were rushing into that opening." Yet, just like before, any formation that tries to advance against the walls is swept away with gunfire. Only a portion of the Forlorn Hope are able to make it to the walls. Those still alive drop to the ground in hopes of avoiding the storm of lead. Seeing Blair's men stop cold, Sherman orders up Still's division to take some pressure off their allies. However, with no cover while crossing the Mid Spring Bayou, Wood's Iowans and Missourians have a miserable experience. Caught in a storm of lead, these Federals hug any low spot they can find and pray they can make it till nightfall. Though Sherman's assault breaks down in the first few minutes, the other two corps are having a better time. Further south, McPherson launches 2 attacks against the rebel lines. In Blackjack Logan's division, J. Smith's Illinoisans make a desperate attack down the Jackson Road against the 3rd Louisiana Redan. But as soon as they get within range of the defending Confederates, they're riddled with lead. One of his soldiers writes of the carnage, "There was about 5,000 that raised up out of the rifle pits and fired on us. We got behind trees, stumps, and logs." Realizing their attack is a waste of lives, Smith's men hide behind cover and trade shots with the defenders until dark. Logan's other attack is led by Stevenson's Illinoisans, who rapidly advance against the southern side of the Great Redoubt. Braving the storm of lead, Stevenson's men get to the walls only to realize their ladders are too short for them to reach the top. With no hope of breaking through, Stevenson's men retreat through a gauntlet of fire to safety. While Logan's men bash their heads against the stubborn rebel defenses, McPherson's other divisions make no effort to attack. Rather, they hide behind the various ravines and contribute nothing. Out of the 3 corps, McClernand's 13th is able to launch the most determined assault against the rebel lines. With a loud cheer, Osterhaus's men attack the square fort, but just like the rest of the attackers that day, they meet a hell of lead. Ironically, defending the fort is President Abraham Lincoln's brother-in-law, Captain David H. Todd. Supporting the defense of the fort are the remnants of Lee's Alabamians, who are looking to get their revenge from Champion Hill. Despite the hope of breaking through, Osterhaus's formations get bogged down in the ravines as the rebels pelt their lines with lead. On McClernand's right, the general aims 2 divisions against the section of walls that defend the railroad. With 2 full divisions aimed at a small section of the line, McClernand hopes this will be where the army finally breaks through. South of the rails, Carr directs Lawler's Iowans and Landrum's Illinoisans against the railroad redoubt. These Midwesterners are able to advance through the storm of lead and plant their flag on the parapets. Here, they get into hand-to-hand combat with the other half of Lee's Alabamians. Yet, in the chaos of battle, the Northerners are stalled in their advance. Across the tracks to the north, the other 2 Midwestern brigades, Benton's and Burbridge's, charge the 2nd Texas Linnet. This Linnet is being defended by one of the most experienced units in the entire Vicksburg garrison, the roughly 468-man 2nd Texas Infantry. Since their baptism of fire at Shiloh, the Texans have seen a great deal of combat in the Western Theater, such as at 1st Corinth, 2nd Corinth, and Snyder's Bluff. Despite all those engagements, these Texans are facing their most critical fight yet. The 2 brigades concentrate their forces at the Linnet. With a charge of bayonets, the Federals rush the walls amid a storm of lead. The Northerners get within range of the parapets but find a 7-foot deep ditch blocking their advance. One of the flag bearers, Thomas J. Higgins of the 99th Illinois, leading a group of men, manages to scurry to the top of the parapets. Impressed by his bravery, the Texans spare his life, but at the cost of his and the flag's capture. The rest, unwilling to brave the storm, hug the ground, with some even trying to undermine the earthwork by digging with their bayonets. The Texans, determined to stop the miners, light artillery shells and drop them down upon the hapless bluecoats. While his troops are fighting for their very lives along the walls, General McClernand believes his men are on the verge of breaking through. Thinking that reinforcements will be enough to finish the job, he writes an urgent message to Grant, declaring, "We are hotly engaged with the enemy. We have part possession of 2 forts, and the stars and stripes are floating over them. A vigorous push ought to be made all along the line." This message is rushed to Grant, who currently is watching the assaults in the north with Sherman. When the general receives the message, he tells his friend, "I don't believe a word of it." Sherman, however, responds by saying, "A major general would at such a critical moment not make a mere bum-cum communication." Upon hearing Sherman, Grant agrees and issues orders for the other 2 corps to restart their attacks at 3 p.m. At the same time, order McPherson to send Quimby's division south to support McClernand. In the north, Sherman restarts his attacks. At 4 p.m., Thayer, with his Iowans at the head of Still's division, charges across a mid-spring bayou, only to be chewed up by rifle fire. Seeing his men so cut up, Thayer reportedly broke out in tears over their massacre. Meanwhile, to the right, Tuttle finally gets his division into action. At the head is Mower's famed Eagle Brigade, named after its famous feathery member, Old Abe, who is carried into battle by the 8th Wisconsin. Old Abe, not shy one bit about the zipping lead, screeches as his men charge down the Graveyard Road. However, just like the other brigades, Mower's men melt away in the storm of lead. To the south, G.A. Smith's and Ransom's Midwesterners make another attempt against the walls. Yet, once back out in the open, their ranks are riddled with lead. Seeing the hopelessness of the charge, both decide the best course of action is to retreat. As Sherman's and McClernand's corps bash their heads against the rebel defenses, Quimby pivots his division south to support McClernand's hotly contested front. When Quimby's troops arrive in McClernand's sector, the general sends them in on a broad front. Boomer's Iowans and Sanborn's Hoosiers are sent against the northern face of the 2nd Texas Lynette. Here, a Texan writes of the assault. Our men, as before, reserved their fire until they approached near, and then pour forth a perfect storm of buck and ball, so that the enemy fell by the hundreds. In the midst of the storm of lead, Boomer, the man who saved the day at Champion Hill, is killed at the head of his troops. Colonel Holden Putnam of the 93rd Illinois Infantry, taking over for Boomer, calls off the attack and retreats to safety. With the repulse of Quimby's division at the 2nd Texas Lynette, the Federals cease their attacks. However, those men who are still stuck in the ditches and ravines continue to fight until after dark. For the poor, unlucky souls who lie wounded in no man's land between the lines, their next battle has already commenced. With Grant refusing to ask for a truce, the dead and dying Federals are stuck in no man's land until they can be rescued. Those who try to move to safety attract a sharpshooter's bullet. When the Federals finally tally their losses that night, the results are staggering, with 3,200 men killed, wounded, and missing. In contrast, the rebels, who only lost roughly 500 men, are delighted at the result. Grant, upon receiving the reports of the fight, is furious with McClernand for his duplicity. For many in the Federal High Command, the Illinois general has become enemy number one. The biggest conclusion from the May 22nd assault is that Grant realizes Vicksburg cannot be taken by storm. With too much open ground to cover, various obstacles across, and well-placed parapets, the Federals had little hope at the start of carrying the works by force alone. After 2 failed attempts, Grant concludes the only way he can take the stubborn city is by forcing the garrison to capitulate, the very option that the commanding general tried to avoid at all costs. As the soldiers on both sides talk and collect their thoughts from the previous day's assaults, one word begins to filter around as no end seems to be in sight: siege. The following day, May 23rd, the two sides agreed to a 2-hour truce to bury the dead. In a light rain, the vast majority of those who were killed are buried where they fell. As the gruesome work moves along, the men on both sides decide to go out and mingle in no man's land. The men greet each other, talk, and trade their belongings. Sergeant William Murray of the 33rd Illinois writes of the encounter, "We met on friendly terms, shook hands, and talked about the war in good humor. Once the truce expires, the men return to their lines and restart the hostilities." Grant, after reflecting upon the previous assaults, is fully convinced the only way to capture Vicksburg now is to outcamp the enemy. Thus, on May 25th, Grant issues Special Order No. 140, which officially proclaims the start of the siege. The special order declares, Corps commanders will immediately commence the work of reducing the enemy by regular approaches. It is desirable that no more loss of life shall be sustained in the reduction of Vicksburg and the capture of the garrison. Every advantage will be taken to gain positions from which to start mines, trenches, or advanced batteries. With the announcement, the Federal soldiers begin digging the trenches to surround the rebel garrison. Once the trenches are complete, approaches are started to give the soldiers a safe avenue to get near the enemy. These earthworks are often called zigzags for their zigzagging pattern to ensure the men cannot be shot by the defenders. While the infantry digs towards the enemy, batteries are placed on high ridges to bombard the town. In total, the Federals will build roughly a 12-mile ring of earthworks around Vicksburg to ensure that all avenues of escape are gone. Once their own entrenchments are complete, the Federals begin shooting at the garrison and the town on a daily basis. Sharpshooters on both sides duel ferociously. Anybody caught without cover will get shot. A simple head bob will attract a sharpshooter's bullet. In this battle, the Federals have a decided edge. With more men, better guns, and on the offensive, they have time to rest between shifts, allowing them to be a lot fresher when on the front lines. Whereas the Confederates, trapped inside the city, rationing food, have to man the front line around the clock. Meanwhile, as the sharpshooters duel, the artillery trades shots as well. Just like the infantry fight, the Federal artillery has the advantage. Any southern cannon that protrudes from the walls attracts intense shelling. While not aiming at rebel artillery, the Federals target the town. Their favorite targets are churches, hospitals, and houses. Once Porter receives Grant's announcement, he joins in with his naval mortars. Yet, unlike the land pieces, the mortars are highly inaccurate. Rarely, if ever, do they hit their intended targets. The civilians, unable to live in their homes due to the incessant shelling, dig holes in the bluffs to avoid the flying bombs. These caves are quite often crowded, with 20 to 25 people per hole. Given the constant bombardment, some inside Vicksburg, civilian and soldier alike, start having mental breakdowns. Lieutenant William Drennan writes to his wife, "The constant tension of their nerves, the fear of their lives, and the continual roar of cannons and small arms have made them fit subjects for the asylum." Though the soldiers and civilians have faced down 2 massive Federal assaults and braved a nearly daily bombardment of the town for almost a week, their morale is nonetheless still high. Even Pemberton, who was despondent after watching his men get herded into Vicksburg, has similarly bounced back following the repulse of Grant's 2 assaults. Now, flushed with confidence, the Pennsylvanian believes he can hold out until Johnston arrives to break the Federal siege. Yet, by the first week of June, over a week since Grant last attacked, the promised savior of Vicksburg has not moved an inch from Canton. With a force of nearly 31,000 men, the only thing Johnston has done since was tell Davis he is too weak to save Vicksburg. With Grant's strangulation of the town, Johnston has found it hard to communicate with the subordinates. Unable to effectively communicate with Pemberton, Johnston sends multiple couriers on different routes to deliver a simple message: cut your way out of Vicksburg. When Richmond gets word of Johnston's proposal, they become alarmed. Secretary of War James said and warns Johnston that Vicksburg must not be lost without a desperate struggle. President Davis, equally anxious about the city's survival, meets with General Robert E. Lee about Longstreet potentially transferring west with 2 divisions. Lee, however, in the midst of planning a second invasion of the North, outright rejects the plan. While Johnston fails to do anything but move, a different theater commander's taken proactive steps to save Pemberton. In the Trans-Mississippi Theater, Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith, who was sent out west to replace the inept Holmes, orders Major General Richard Taylor to relieve the pressure off of Vicksburg. The troops Smith supplies to Taylor are Walker's Greyhounds, a new 5,000-man division composed entirely of Texas regiments led by Major General John G. Walker. From his base at Richmond, Dick Taylor orders the division's 3 brigades to attack the Union depots at Milken's Bend, Young's Point, and Lake Providence. Unknown to the Confederates, these places lost their significance when Porter moved Grant's supply line to Haynes Bluff, but they remain as training grounds for the newly raised African regiments, filled mainly by runaway slaves. On June 7th, McCullough's brigade attacks Milken's Bend and drives the poorly trained black troops into the river. The black troops are on the verge of being annihilated, but are saved by the late arrival of the ironclad USS Choctaw, whose 100-pound cannons drive off the victorious Texans. Just like at Milken's Bend, the rebels see no success at Young's Point or Lake Providence. as the other two brigades failed to make any concerted push against the remaining Federal depots. Unable to achieve any measurable success in Louisiana, Dick Taylor does not try to help Pemberton any further. As the Confederate High Command scrambles to find anybody who can help the beleaguered Vicksburg garrison, Grant likewise calls on his government to send him troops to solidify a siege. With his current force decimated from the assaults and scattered to watch for Johnston, Grant sends orders for Hurlbut to detach 2 divisions from the 16th Corps. While Grant is calling up Hurlbut, Halleck is likewise calling on the other department heads to hasten men to Vicksburg. Rosecrans, who has sat on his hands since the New Year fight at Stones River, decides to finally advance against Bragg and Tullahoma. Burnside, who now commands the Department of the Ohio after his failure at Fredericksburg, willingly detaches 2 divisions from this 9th Corps to Grant. Finally, in the Trans-Mississippi Theater, Schofield is also willing to help Grant and sends him 2 divisions from his department. Among the troops arriving to reinforce Grant is the 79th New York Infantry, which is better known as the 79th New York Highlanders. These Scots first served under Sherman during the First Battle of Bull Run and are delighted to see their former commander again after 2 years. When the Scots see Sherman, they give him a wild cheer. With all the troops flooding in to secure the stranglehold over Vicksburg, their combined strength raises Grant's total force from 38,000 to 77,000 men. Despite receiving substantial reinforcements from across the country, Grant is still anxious about Johnston's presence. Expecting Confederate relief army to march through the Mechanicsburg corridor, Grant sends Brigadier General Nathan Kimball, who was last wounded at Fredericksburg, to patrol the area. Yet, during the rebel assaults against the Federal depots on the Mississippi, Johnston sends some of his forces toward Yazoo City. This movement startles Kimball, who believes it is the entire rebel army marching against him and flees back to the Federal lines. Grant, wanting to discover the truth himself, boards a steamer and sails up the Yazoo to Sartasha. However, the trip does not turn out as expected. The general, who's not feeling well, breaks his vow of sobriety and drinks to ease the discomfort. But instead of drinking a small amount, Grant drinks enough to pass out on a cot. His staff does their best to hide the intoxicated general from any prying eyes. Once his excursion returns to Haynes Bluff, Grant is brought to his tent in an ambulance wagon. Upon hearing the news, Rawlins writes a scolding letter to the general for his lapse. Luckily for Grant and his men, if Johnston did not want to attack when the Confederate forces outnumbered the Federals at the beginning of the siege, there is no way that Virginia will try now after 3 weeks, when Grant now holds an numerical advantage. With Johnston's passiveness, Grant is free to expedite his efforts to force an end to the siege, possibly with it going out with a bang. By June 15th, the Federals in Sherman's and McPherson's Corps have managed to get their approaches within range of the rebel defenses to begin mining operations. Yet, across the railroad, McClernand has slacked off, falling far behind the other 2 corps. Engineer Peter Haynes tries to encourage McClernand and his men to catch up, but they find every excuse not to speed up. As the Federals steadily approach the rebel fortifications, the 2 sides continue to trade shots with each other. On the Federal side, the Northerners fire their guns from 6 a.m. in the morning to 6 p.m. at night to ensure that the rebels have no chance of repairing their increasingly damaged earthworks. However, on the rebel side, the Southerners fear responding with their own artillery, as they would be obliterated the second they return fire. Though the Federals hold the advantage in artillery, the sharpshooter remains a balanced affair. On the 17th, during a duel between sharpshooters, Colonel Isham W. Garrett, commanding the square fort, is shot in the head and killed instantly. Unbeknownst to Garrett, he was recently promoted to brigadier general in May, but the news of his promotion never reached him. Saddened by the loss, Pemberton renames the square fort in his honor. While the 2 sides are trading lead, a bombshell hits the Federal High Command on the evening of June 17th. Sherman, reading a new edition of the Memphis Evening Bulletin, discovers a congratulatory message from McClernand to his troops in the newspaper. Knowing that McClernand never received authorization to publish his message, Grant decides this is a final straw for the self-aggrandizing Illinois general. Though Grant had weathered McClernand's disrespect, insubordination, and scheming since the beginning of the campaign, he decided to wait for the perfect moment to get rid of this insolent political general. Now, with his actions violating the War Department's orders regarding publications, Grant released McClernand on June 18th. Taking over the 13th Corps' Major General Edward O.C. Ord, a close friend of Grant's who has finally returned from a nasty wound received at the Battle of Hatchie's Bridge in October of 1862. On June 22nd, Grant receives news that 10 saps have reached the vicinity of the fortifications, with Blackjack Logan's approach aimed at the 3rd Louisiana Redan being the best. With that news, Grant orders mining operations to begin in preparation to blow up the rebel fortifications. The next day, 35 miners from the 45th and 124th Illinois regiments are recruited to begin digging out tunnels to place explosives. While the Federals work, the Confederates on top hear their pickaxes hacking away and try to countermine, but to no avail. Unable to locate the Federal miners, the rebels pull the majority of their men back from the Redan. On June 23rd, the miners report that the mine is complete and is packed with gunpowder. Anxious to get the siege over with, Grant gives orders for the mine to be blown and assault launched in 2 days. The brigade chosen to spearhead the assault is Leggett's Illinoisans, who have been primarily responsible for the mine. If and when Leggett's men break through, the other corps order to be ready to attack as well. On the 25th, with all ready, the mine is lit at 3 p.m. However, just when all expected the mine to blow, nothing happens. The Federals, apprehensive about the attack, wait in silence for something to happen. Then, at around 3:30 p.m., after 30 grueling minutes, the spark finally reaches the powder and blows up. The entire 3rd Louisiana Redan, logs, cannons, and all are lifted high into the air as a billowing cloud of dirt, smoke, and dust covers the area. In the midst of the explosion, 8 unlucky Mississippians, who are still searching for the Federal mine, disappear in the blast. Once the fallen debris clears, Leggett launches his brigade into the hole. Not expecting stiff resistance, Leggett's men push their way through to a point where they become jam-packed. The defending Confederates, seeing the savory moment, unleash everything they have upon the attackers. Lit grenades are rolled down into the hole, bayonets are thrown as spears, and lead is fiercely exchanged. The crowded Illinoisans return fire the best they can, with the rear ranks reloading and passing their rifles forward. Riding in the fight, one Illinoisan says, they held their position and fought desperately until the guns were too hot for further use. Unable to break through the deadlock, the two sides fight throughout the night. Once the sun rises on the 26th, a wounded Leggett realizes that the new rebel position is too strong to crack and pulls out. Despite the explosion and hard fighting throughout the night, the casualties remained surprisingly low. Leggett lost 209 men, while the rebels only lost 94. Though most sat idly by watching the battle, those who had to face the carnage in the crater called it the death hole. Though the Confederates repelled Grant's attempt at blowing his way through to the Bluff City, Pemberton realizes how precarious his position has become with all the Federal approaches. It will only be a matter of time until Grant tries to blow up another section of the walls. With this predicament, Pemberton knows if Johnston does not arrive soon, his exhausted men will only face larger detonations and bloodier assaults in the days to come. Hebert, whose troops stopped the attack, writes about their desperate situation most poignantly. The Federals are now in a position to appear in our works at any instant. By the end of June, the situation in Vicksburg has become bleak. The Confederate garrison is at the end of their food supply. The soldiers have essentially manned the earthworks since the May assaults, and all have lost hope in Johnston coming to their rescue. Those who cannot take the strain of constant bombardments desert their post. Each day, dozens of soldiers abandon their position and surrender to the besiegers, slowly weakening the rebel defenses. As they filter through the Federal lines, they supply the Northerners with crucial information regarding the deteriorating conditions within the walls. As word filters through the Federal camps concerning the state of the rebel garrison, many cannot help but believe the siege is nearing its end. Porter reckons the rebels will call it quits before the end of June, whereas Grant, writing to his wife Julia, says, "During the present week, I think the fate of Vicksburg will be decided." Yet, the commanding general still believes Johnston will attempt to relieve the garrison before Pemberton gives up. While the upper echelons of the army contemplate when the siege will end, some in the rank and file start the joke that the rebels will surrender on Independence Day. On June 27th, Brigadier General Martin E. Greene, a steadfast brigade commander in the Western Theater, is killed in a skirmish. Right before the fight, Greene announces to his men, "A bullet has not yet been molded that will kill me." After uttering those words, Greene pops his head over the walls to look out and is killed instantly with a shot to the head. With the death of Greene, Colonel Thomas P. Dockery of the 19th Arkansas takes over command of the brigade. Around the same time as Greene's death, the 43rd Mississippi Infantry loses its favorite member, Douglas a Camel. During a daily skirmish, a Federal sharpshooter sees and kills Douglas as he is grazing behind the regiment's position. Infuriated with his death, Colonel Robert S. Bevier calls on 6 of his best shots to hunt down the culprit. In the ensuing exchange, the Mississippians manage to wound the man who killed their beloved Camel. Once the members receive the news of the culprit's wounding, the men raise a resounding cheer. On the 28th, Pemberton receives an anonymous letter from many of his soldiers that shakes his confidence in holding Vicksburg. The letter states that due to the lack of provisions, the men are on the verge of mutiny. If Pemberton cannot feed them, the best course of action is to surrender. Pemberton, unsettled by the message, sends a circular to his division commanders concerning their bleak situation, whether to ask for terms or to break out. The general states he leans towards the former. Bowen and Smith propose terms, while Forney and Stevenson only argue against a breakout. On July 1st, Grant, one of the scared rebels, orders McPherson to blow up another mine near the crater. At 3 p.m., the mine goes off and the defenders brace for another attack, but none comes. The next day, believing that Johnston is on the verge of attacking, Grant decides to take his chances with another army-wide assault. Thus, the general orders the approaches to be widened and his men prepare for another charge against the earthworks. Not wanting to wait around for Johnston to advance, Grant determines to blow up all the mines and follow up with an overwhelming force to crush the Confederate garrison once and for all. Whatever the case, the siege of Vicksburg will come to an end on July 6, 2 days after Independence Day. On the morning of July 3, 1863, as the Federals steadily prepare themselves for the overwhelming assault that will come on the 6th, all is quiet across no man's land in Vicksburg. With the Federal saps only yards away from the rebel lines, food supplies at a critical level, and morale within the garrison at an all-time low, Pemberton knows he must make a crucial decision and soon. Following the circular that was sent around a few nights before, the Pennsylvania agrees that asking for terms is the best course of action. At 8 a.m. that morning, Bowen, leading a group of emissaries under a white flag, approaches the Federal line. Once at the Federal earthworks, Bowen hands over a note written by Pemberton, who is asking for an armistice. With the two sides now in communication, the firing finally ceases. In the peculiar silence, the men on both sides pop up from their cover and curiously look at each other. When Grant receives the note brought by Bowen, he quickly replies with his famous line, "You can stop this effusion of blood at any time by an unconditional surrender of the city and garrison." Bowen, disappointed by the news, asks to speak with Grant, his friend from before the war, but is rebuffed. Hearing that Grant will only meet with somebody of equal command, Bowen lies and informs Grant's emissary that Pemberton would like to meet with the general. Grant agrees, and the two sides decide to meet again at 3 p.m. that afternoon. Once the meeting is set, Bowen and his group return to Vicksburg and inform Pemberton of the news. Instead of telling the general the truth, Bowen lies and tells Pemberton that Grant wants to meet with him. Hearing the news, Pemberton also agrees. Once 3 p.m. strikes, both generals and their parties make their way to the designated location. As word spreads that the generals are meeting, men on both sides rush to the front to watch it. When the generals come face to face, they trade some pleasantries before getting down to business. This is not the first time the two generals have met, as they knew each other from the Mexican-American War, having served in the same division. Once the pleasantries are over, the two generals become confused about the purpose of the meeting, as they thought the other had requested it. Once Pemberton realizes that it was Bowen who arranged the meeting, he becomes frustrated. Annoyed at the situation, Pemberton bluntly asks if the unconditional surrender term still stands. Grant affirms. Hearing Grant's response, Pemberton scoffs and calls for the meeting to end and for the fighting to resume. Grant, also seeing no point in continuing, agrees. Bowen, seeing the meeting spiraling out of control, intervenes and proposes that the lower officers try to discuss the terms themselves. Seeing no harm, the two commanders agree. While the other officers meet, Grant and Pemberton sit around and chat. Once they are done, the lower officers return and present their generous terms, which Grant quickly refuses. Unable to come to an agreement, Grant tells Pemberton that he will send over his final offer that night. When Grant returns to his lines, he meets with his corps commanders to discuss the final offer. The general mentions that he wants to send the entire garrison to prison camps up north. Yet when Grant says this, the majority of officers disagree, citing the cost of housing, feeding, and transporting all the prisoners. Instead, they propose paroling the entire garrison, saying that this action will tempt many to desert the rebel army. Seeing the wisdom in this train of thought, Grant agrees and sends the final offer over to Pemberton at 10 p.m. Once Pemberton receives the offer, he reluctantly accepts the terms and sends back his reply early the next morning with a few amendments. Grant, annoyed by this, sends one last message stating that if he does not receive a reply by 9 a.m., he will regard the terms as rejected and act accordingly. However, not long after sending the message, Grant receives Pemberton's reply and sighs with relief. Announcing to his son Fred, he declares, "Vicksburg has surrendered." Thus, on July 4th, 1863, the 87th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, Pemberton surrenders Vicksburg to Grant. Following the surrender, Grant's army marches in and takes control of the town. While the army moves in, officers of McPherson's 17th Corps climb to the top of the courthouse and plant their flag as wild cheers and cannon salute fill the air. As the Federal soldiers shout with glee, the despondent rebels stack their arms, sign their parole papers, and head the Enterprise to start their parole. The siege of Vicksburg, which has lasted for 47 long days, has finally come to an end. With the siege over, the casualties are counted to see the true extent of the disaster that has befallen the Confederacy on July 4th. During the siege, the Federals lost 4,910 men, while the Confederates lost 2,872 men, with the majority of the garrison, 29,491, surrendering. The rest either refused to surrender and were sent to northern prison camps, died in the hospital, or escaped capture. Compared to all the defeats since the beginning of the war, the capture of Vicksburg by Grant is an unmitigated disaster for the Confederacy. With the loss of an entire army, the capture of Vicksburg, and the eventual surrender of Port Hudson 5 days later on July 9th, the Confederacy is effectively cut in two. The Anaconda Plan, which was set forth at the beginning of the war, now has completely wrapped around the eastern half of the Confederacy. No longer will the Confederates be able to ship men and material across the Mississippi. Those still in the rebellion in the Trans-Mississippi Theater are now on their own for the rest of the war. From the lowest private to the corps commanders, they serenade Grant with praise. Colonel Marcus M. Spiegel, who first lambasted Grant during their tumultuous winter stay in Louisiana, said, "Grant is the greatest chieftain of the ages. The boys worship him." Sherman, who's on the Big Black watching out for Johnston, writes, "Grant is now deservedly the hero. He's entitled to all the credit." While Grant was sieging out Vicksburg, Lee attempted a second invasion of the North but was stopped at a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg. Though Meade halted Lee's advance in Pennsylvania, he failed to follow up on his success and let the Gray Fox escape further harm. Despite the win at Gettysburg, when news of Vicksburg's surrender is transmitted across the nation, the people go wild with excitement. Church bells ring, fireworks are lit, and celebrations are held. Lincoln, upon hearing the news, exclaims to Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, "I cannot, in the words, tell you my joy over this result. It is great, Mr. Welles, it is great." While the General-in-Chief Henry W. Halleck, who, at the beginning of the war, felt threatened by Grant's success, writes of the capture, "In boldness of plan, rapidity of execution, and brilliancy of results, these operations will compare most favorably with those of Napoleon at Ulm." As the North celebrates Grant's capture of Vicksburg, the Confederacy bemoans its loss. With an army of 30,000 out of action and a country irreparably cut in two, few across the South couldn't help but think that Pemberton, a Northerner by birth, is a traitor who sold them out. First Sergeant William Pitt Chambers expresses the sentiment clearly. "Oh, how burned the haggard cheek with shame and indignation to realize that on that day of all others, Vicksburg should be surrendered." Many who defended Vicksburg believed the country did not try hard enough to save them, and many blamed both Davis and Johnston for the lack of support. As the Southerners cope with the loss, President Davis, depressed by the news, believes that Pemberton did what he could and lays the blame for the loss of Vicksburg solely on Johnston by stating, "Yes, from want of provisions inside and a general outside who wouldn't fight." During the siege, Johnston did little and never attempted any concerted push against the Federal lines. Despite these jabs, Johnston defends himself by arguing that there was little he could have done once Grant made communication between the two forces difficult. Following the capture of Vicksburg, Grant starts Sherman in motion against Johnston to ensure the conquest is secure. On July 5th, Sherman marches east with 40,000 men from the 9th, 13th, and 15th Corps towards Jackson, which was recaptured by the rebels. After 5 days of marching, Sherman arrives at the state capital and puts it under siege. However, Johnston, seeing that he's heavily outnumbered, only stays for 6 days before abandoning the town. Once Sherman receives word of Johnston's retreat, he enters Jackson and destroys anything that was left standing. Unbeknownst to many across the two embattled countries, the siege and capture of Vicksburg is a turning point in the war between the states. With the Confederacy cut in two, a whole rebel army out of action, and victorious Federal armies marching about the continent, many in the South, who witnessed a Confederate resurgence during the past winter, couldn't help but see that these disasters in the summer of 1863 reversed any gains made. Seeing how much of a disaster losing access to the Mississippi is for the Confederate war effort, Grant simply noted the change he felt in the atmosphere. The fate of the Confederacy was sealed when Vicksburg fell.